thank you, Thea, for joining this DRR Pioneers interview. I'd like to know how you initially got engaged in DRR work.
Well, of course, I'm a scholar, so I'm not engaged in that sense in DRR. I'm a scholar. I'm working on disasters since the I think around 2000, the year 2000.
Okay, and what were your major achievements in those early days, or your major insights in those early days? I remember you organized also a workshop on vulnerability with some of the pioneers at that time. So I think there was already a strong interest in social dimensions of disaster at that time. Could you explain a bit what your insights were at that?
Yes, definitely. So at the very start, when we started working on disaster, of course, we just had for 10 years or so the idea of the vulnerability paradigm. And then in the 1990s, people also started to talk about resilience. So there was something there where it was resilience. Was it the flip side of vulnerability, or was it something else? But we still felt at the time vulnerability was a key concept to understand disasters and its root causes. So we did have a very initially in 2002 or something, we had this wonderful workshop in Wageningen, and that culminated in the book about mapping vulnerability with Greg Benkoff and Gerard Freerks. Now, at that time, disaster risk reduction for me, but maybe that's very much my the corner where I was sitting, was very much coming from the more radical disaster studies and from more development oriented community based work. Whereas how I saw disaster risk reduction evolve in the years after that is that it sort of lost its cutting edge and became more of a technocratic endeavor to respond to risks that could result in disasters. And what sort of seemed to disappear sometimes is why would people be exposed to disasters, or what is the deeper reason why those risks have emanated? Why are those risks there? So what I find quite interesting, it's not like new, but it's catchy, this idea that you say, okay, we have disaster risk reduction, but at the same time there's something as disaster risk creation. So and that disaster risk creation, as I mentioned, it's not really new. It is kind of, for me, it is the idea that you almost uh, reinvigorate the idea of the politics of disaster risk reduction, and that disasters are socially constructed and created and politically created most of the time. So we try to invigorate the concept by now using the term disaster risk creation, and showing and seeing that very often the efforts to disaster risk reduce are outweighed by increasing disaster risk creation. So I find that a very interesting way forward. I think Ilan Kelman coined this idea of disaster risk, the term disaster risk creation. Yeah.
Okay, and I mean, teaching in Wageningen also meant you had to work in a more transdisciplinary or interdisciplinary way. I mean, at least what I remember from Wageningen was that there was an attempt to bring different sciences together and look for synergies. Was this also the case in your work with disaster studies, or did you mainly focus on social science issues? Or
Now, what I thought was very special, what we did in Wageningen, and that is that from the very start, we talked about disasters as encompassing disasters triggered by natural hazards and conflict. And I think that is what made us quite unique in Wageningen, that we were rather early on trying to see the nexus between conflict and disaster, and looking at both. So we also looked at peace building, we also looked at humanitarianism, intervention. So we had a rather comprehensive way of looking at disaster, unlike many of the institutes I've come across that are either specializing in disasters or in conflicts, but don't combine it, or in humanitarianism and development. And we somehow mixed all that in Wageningen. And I always thought it was very fruitful.
Okay, I mean, and this was probably one of the main lessons or insights you gained during those early days, which you think is still relevant today, or even more relevant today, as many hazards and natural hazards are occurring in countries which are also very fragile and also prone to conflict. Which I think you were indeed a pioneer in this field, and it just became more relevant over the decades, no?
Yeah, it's been very surprising to us. Maybe because in Wageningen from the start we saw the connections, and we defined ourselves as disaster scholars, looking at those different types of disasters and also how they interacted. And we have found it very natural, and hence I have found it very shocking almost to see in the first in the Yogo and then in the Sendai framework of action no reference at all to conflict. And also in the preparations, I remember I was sitting in a ALNAP meeting in New York, I think, and it was a big room, and we were going to talk about disasters triggered by natural hazards. And then I mentioned, yeah, but let's also talk about conflict, because more than 30% of those disasters happen in conflict areas. And then the chair just hushed me and said, yeah, we all know that, but here we will focus on the disasters with the natural hazards. I thought, wow, that is one third of it gone. And later it also turns out that it's one third more or less of the frequency of disasters. But if you look at the death toll, because of course in conflict affected areas the vulnerabilities are higher, response capacities are less. So if you look at the death toll, the conflict and fragility affected areas, they have like 60%, I think, of everybody who dies in disaster. So it is a very, very important topic. Now, because we were interested in Wageningen from the very start, I was also having a bit of a headway and able to organize a 5-year academic research program with 4 PhD candidates and a post with quite a substantive team for 4 years to look at instances where conflict meets disaster, where disaster meets conflict. Yeah.
Okay. Would the reason that there's a lack of interest in bringing together these different fields also relate to some of the mandates the different UN agencies have, and the fact that they do not want to overstep their own mandate? I mean, I can imagine that for UNDRR, as it is called now, they would find it hard to fully embrace conflict as a topic, although there is definitely progress. I mean, I remember in the latest global platform there were sessions on that, but my experience has always been that if you deal with UN agencies, they're kind of strictly defending their own realms and are less open to this kind of cross-sectoral thinking than the academics would be.
I'm not sure if it's mandate, because if, or is it perhaps a lack of um, real intention to work bottom up. Because if you look at communities, we did a research once for the Partners for Resilience, which was also not looking at conflict at the time. And when we were talking to people in all the implementing countries of Partners for Resilience and really talk to people from communities, they all raised this issue. Like, we have so many conflicts, why is PFR not looking at the conflict side of things? And it's intimately connected. And I'm not even talking big conflict between countries, for example, or, think Syria, think Yemen. But the local conflicts that are happening around resource extraction are everywhere, everywhere. Social tension around resource extraction. And DRR works on resources. It is about planting trees, but where do you plant a tree? Who plants the trees? Who will earn from it? And those are questions that in every single community rip communities apart. If you feel that mining companies are threatening the environment and hence trigger renewed risks for disasters, they do with disaster risk creation, you're head on into a conflict at a local level. So, to my mind, this is about the yeah, issues that you encounter when you implement, when you do DRR. Now, other issues that have come across is, of course, we have now much more attention to climate as a factor, climate change, what it does, Another important issue, I think, that was not very obvious in DRR efforts at the beginning is migration. Very little attention to migration and hence to urbanity. Urban issues and DRR are very slow to develop. And then the conflict. Yeah.
I mean, and nowadays, of course, DRR work is very much, I'm not saying dominated, but at least strongly influenced by the whole climate thinking and the link with climate adaptation. Do you see this as an added value, or do you see also some challenges in bringing these together in kind of one, almost in an equation?
I think it is very important to take the climate into account. What I also see is a tendency to turn climate and climate change into a hazard, as in the old generations of disaster study, that the hazard is the disaster. And of course, it's not. Climate change in and of itself is not a disaster. And that's why it is so important not to forget what I call the iron law of disaster studies, that disasters are the outcome of the encounter of risks, of hazards, vulnerability mitigated by capacities. And for me, that is still the iron law of disaster studies. And it's the same in climate change. Climate change in and of itself is not a disaster, it's a hazard. It meets vulnerabilities, and if it's not properly mitigated by policy measures, then we get a disaster. And we always forget that. And then people can say, oh, it's climate change, it's happening out there. No, they have a role. It becomes a disaster because of the policies they have. So it's very important to bring in climate change, but do it within the framework of critical, or not even critical, basic disaster studies.
So to some extent, I mean, by focusing too strongly on climate as a hazard, you return to a more technocratic kind of hazard-centric approach, and you tend to kind of oversee the underlying causes and the root causes of people's vulnerability.
No, of course, and that's the whole issue. So climate change is the hazard. It doesn't explain in itself the vulnerabilities, and it also is no excuse for a lack of action on the ground and lack of policies on the ground. So that is why climate change is super important, but it has to still be analyzed and seen in that framework that we develop for disasters, where we say, wait a minute, the hazard is not a disaster. A disaster risk comes about when the hazard meets vulnerabilities and are not mitigated by measures or policies. That's when you get a disaster. And that's the same with climate change and the same with earthquakes. So if we take it within that frame, I think the climate change discussion is very enriching. Where there is a problem, of course, is that people may start to believe too strongly that disasters are the outcome of climate change, forgetting other ways in which vulnerabilities have grown, for example, as something as evident as population growth, is kind of put to the back burner in relation or in comparison to concerns about climate change.
Mm-hmm. And then there's, of course, I mean, it's been debated so many times, the whole concept of resilience being a term that can be undermine can undermine the vulnerability thinking, or but it could also stress the capacities that people have and have a more positive outlook on things. But is this still something you embrace in your academic world, also in a conflict context where people may not necessarily be very resilient because the conflicts have a very strong impact on people's lives and on society?
Well, I think so resilience is an extremely important topic and concept also in conflict, because if humanitarian action, other measures don't build on what people already do and can do to mitigate the effects of of conflict, they undermine people's efforts. So the arguments to build on people's capacities are extremely strong. Now, where things go funny is that resilience has been embraced as a mainstreaming argument and brought into large meta global policies from the World Bank and others, where resilience seems to be used and instrumentalized not to build on people's capacities, but to bank on people's capacities and sort of stand to the side and say, wow, aren't those people wonderfully resilient? And that will lead, if you're not careful, to politics of abandonment rather than resilience. And that is, for example, the work of Suzanne Jaspers, I find very relevant in Sudan, where she actually shows that agencies started to talk resilience and claiming people's resilience, used it as an excuse to lower the rations for food aid. But there was no evidence of this resilience. There was no evidence that people could manage. It was just sort of, talk going around, the discourse. Wow, people are so resilient. Wow, people are greatly resilient. Let's lower the food rations. But if people don't have other means to get their food, that is not building on their capacities, that's abandoning.
Well, this is very insightful. I'm given the limited time. Maybe I'll conclude the interview with a question about who were your main influences, or who were the people that you built your thinking on when you were still a young academic and have influenced your work up to today. And maybe people you dealt with directly, but it could also be some publications that have really been an inspiring source for your thinking. Maybe many.
Yeah, many. But of course, the first who come to mind would be the people who did at risk, but also Ken Hewitt, and definitely also Anthony Oliver Smith and Maureen Fordham when it came, and Elaine Enerson. I rather quickly catched on the idea that disasters, as everything else, is very gendered, and we have to understand the gender dimensions and aspects of disaster. So those would be, and that was the funny thing when you speak historically, that our group in Wageningen only started properly around the turn of the century. But it so happens that we had yeah, it was like a serendipity somehow. We had the resources and the initiative to form the workshop, and apparently it was the right time to come up with a book about vulnerability. So all these folks showed up. So it was like not only a very rich gathering of people that create a very nice book, but it was also suddenly, as a young academic, that you are surrounded by all those people that you refer to. I mean, you organize a workshop and your whole bibliography was there. It was a very, for me personally as well, a very special occasion. And what is
Organize
very
it.
nice is that we are having a sequel. Greg Benkov and I are now working on a next book about vulnerability and the politics of disaster risk creation. I think is our working title. We have a contract with Routledge, and we bring together quite a few of the old folks. Ken Hewitt is there, Ian Burton is there, Ben Wisner, Terry Cannon. So it's really lovely, and some of them are now in their 80s, and it's like they are writing the testament of everything they've seen in their working lives in their papers and their chapters. So I think it's going to be a very prominent and nice book.
Yeah, we're looking forward to reading it. And Ben already mentioned it to me. And I think it's very interesting to see the term risk reduction now being moved into risk creation, which I think many scholars, also like Alan Novell and others, have said is the real issue. And that this is going to be tackled also academically and hopefully over time in practice and in policy as well. Thank you so much for your contribution to the field, and thank you so much for the interview, and I wish you all the very best. Thanks so much.
And you, thanks for this initiative.